Dad, look, I can stand. Richard Donovan, the millionaire tycoon who ruled boardrooms and broke rivals without mercy, dropped his glass. The stem shattered in his hand, red wine bleeding across the marble floor like a wound. His sharp blue eyes widened, locked on the trembling figure across the room. His son, 7-year-old Ethan, was on his feet, for the first time in his life. Gasps echoed through the lavish banquet hall. "Impossible," someone whispered. "He hasn't walked since birth." Richard's chest tightened. Doctors had told him there was no hope. Our own therapists had failed. Years of money, of desperate searching, had brought him nothing but more disappointment. Ethan had lived in a wheelchair since infancy. Richard had secretly resigned himself to a lifetime of pitying glances and quiet shame. And yet, here was his son, legs shaking, arms stretched out like wings, standing tall before a stunned crowd. Richard's voice cracked. "Ethan, how?" The boy's lips trembled, his small fingers pointing toward the corner of the room. All eyes turned. There, half hidden in the shadows, stood Grace Johnson, the young black maid Richard had hired only months ago. She was holding back tears, her hands clenched nervously against her apron. The air turned electric. It couldn't be true. She was just a maid. She was supposed to clean floors, carry trays, blend into the background. And yet, something in her gaze told Richard that she carried a secret that might explain the impossible. The guests began to murmur. Some looked horrified, others curious. Richard's face hardened as he took a step forward, his voice low and trembling between anger and disbelief. "What did you do?" Grace didn't answer. Not yet, but her silence was more powerful than any words, and it made the entire room lean forward in anticipation. Because everyone knew, behind that silence, behind that steady gaze, was the truth that would change the Donovan family forever. And for Richard Donovan, the man who thought he controlled everything, it was only the beginning of the most humbling lesson of his life. Stories like this remind us that miracles don't come from power or wealth, but from the quiet strength of those we least expect. If you believe in the power of love and resilience, stay with us until the end of this story. And if you like it, please subscribe and comment. If you don't like it, please like. Richard Donovan stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. The echo of his son's trembling words, "Dad, look, I can stand," still rang in his ears. The entire banquet hall was suspended in disbelief, the weight of the moment pressing against every glittering wall. For a man like Richard, whose empire stretched from Manhattan skyscrapers to oil fields in Texas, control was everything. He had bought out companies, silenced rivals, and reshaped entire industries. But when it came to his own son, Ethan, his billions had bought him nothing but frustration and heartache. Doctors in pristine white coats had told him there was no cure. Therapists had promised progress, but eventually gave up. Richard had tried experimental surgeries, imported treatments, even whispered prayers at midnight when no one was watching. Still, Ethan remained in his wheelchair, fragile and withdrawn. And now, without warning, his boy was standing, because of her, Grace Johnson. Richard's sharp eyes locked onto her across the hall. The black maid stood quietly, almost shrinking against the polished wooden paneling, but her eyes betrayed something fierce. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't even surprised. She knew. The guests began to whisper among themselves. Was it her? Did she train him? Why didn't the Donovans say anything? Richard clenched his jaw. "Enough," he barked, silencing the murmurs. His voice carried the authority of a man used to obedience. But inside, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. To understand that night, one had to step back months earlier, to the day Grace first entered the Donovan mansion. She wasn't like the others. Most maids kept their heads down, voices soft, hands busy with silver trays and feather dusters. Grace, though humble, carried herself with quiet confidence. Richard had dismissed it at first. He didn't care about her background, only her ability to keep the household running. But Ethan noticed. The boy who rarely spoke, who shrank under the weight of pity, found in Grace a kind of presence he couldn't ignore. She never treated him as broken. She never flinched at his wheelchair or spoke in hushed tones like others. Instead, she would look him in the eyes and say things like, "You've got more strength in you than anyone realizes, Ethan." Small words, simple encouragements. Yet for a child who had only heard limits, those words were sparks. At first, Richard barely paid attention. He was consumed by his business. Deals stacked on his desk higher than the Empire State Building. The maid was invisible, just part of the background. But Grace wasn't idle. While other staff went about their duties, she spent quiet hours with Ethan. She taught him patience, resilience, and courage. Instead of focusing on what he couldn't do, she celebrated every small victory, lifting himself from the chair, balancing for a second, shifting weight from one leg to another. She saw what doctors had overlooked. Ethan's body wasn't taught incapable. His spirit had been crushed. Fear, not weakness, chained him down. Every stumble was met not with pity, but with firm encouragement. Every tear was answered not with sympathy, but with belief. Slowly, impossibly, Ethan began to change. Richard only realized something was happening when he overheard a conversation late one evening. He had returned from a board meeting, exhausted, when he passed by Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, he heard Grace's steady voice. "Ethan, the world may tell you that you can't. Even your own father may believe it's impossible. But what matters is what you choose to believe. Stand for yourself, and one day they'll all see." Those words stopped Richard cold. Even your own father may believe it's impossible. For a man who had built an empire on unshakable confidence, hearing that his son doubted his faith broke something inside him. He leaned against the wall, torn between anger at the maid's audacity and shame at the truth in her words. That was the moment, though he didn't know it yet, when control began to slip from his hands. The following weeks, Richard watched more closely. He noticed Ethan's posture improving, the way he sat taller, his smile brighter. He noticed how the boy's eyes lit up when Grace entered the room, but suspicion gnawed at him. "What is she doing with my son?" he demanded of his butler one morning. "Nothing improper, sir," the man replied cautiously. "Only, she gives him hope." Hope. Richard scoffed at the word. In his world, hope was weakness. Power was everything. Yet when he looked at his son, he saw the undeniable change. And that terrified him. Because it meant someone else, someone he considered beneath him, was succeeding where he had failed. Now, in the golden glow of the banquet hall, that secret had burst into the open. Ethan was standing, trembling but proud. Grace stood silently, her secret no longer hidden. The room waited for Richard's response. Would he lash out? Would he dismiss it as a trick? Or would he admit, for the first time in his life, that money couldn't buy everything? Richard's hands shook as he pointed at her. His voice cracked, caught between fury and awe. "Tell me the truth, Grace. What did you do to my son?" And there it was, the pivot of the entire story, the moment the audience had been waiting for. The question that would unravel pride, power, and prejudice, exposing the heart of the Donovan family for all to see. The banquet hall held its breath. Grace finally stepped forward, her voice calm, steady, and unafraid. "I didn't do anything to your son, Mr. Donovan. I simply believed in him, when no one else did." The words struck like lightning. The room erupted in gasps, and Richard Donovan, millionaire, tycoon, master of control, felt his entire world tilt. Because for the first time in his life, he realized the greatest wealth might not be measured in dollars, but in faith. The banquet hall remained frozen in disbelief after Grace's quiet words. "I simply believed in him, when no one else did." The crowd gasped, and Richard Donovan felt the walls of certainty closing in. For decades, he had measured life in profits and losses. But here stood his son, defying the impossible because of a maid. But how? To understand the truth, one had to leave the glittering banquet behind and step into the quiet corridors of the Donovan mansion weeks earlier. Ethan's room was nothing like the rest of the house. While the hallways gleamed with imported marble and priceless art, his room was plain, filled only with books, puzzles, and the ever-present wheelchair. It was there late at night when the house was silent that Grace began her secret work. She would kneel by Ethan's side, her voice soft but steady. "One day, Ethan, you'll rise. Not because money paid for it, not because someone told you it's possible. You'll rise because you choose to. At first, Ethan only shook his head. His legs trembled at the very thought of trying. But Grace was patient. She didn't push. She began with tiny steps, not of walking, but of courage. Push yourself up from the chair. Just once, hold on to me if you have to, she encouraged. And he did. The first time he collapsed almost instantly, his arms flailing, tears streaking down his cheeks. But Grace didn't flinch. That's progress, she whispered, brushing his tears away. Even falling is better than not trying at all. Night after night, the routine continued, standing with her support, balancing for a second before gravity won, taking one shaky step, then collapsing. Each fall brought frustration, but each encouragement from Grace rekindled his hope. She refused to let him see himself as weak. Instead, she framed every stumble as a victory. Do you realize, Ethan? Yesterday, you couldn't hold yourself up for 2 seconds. Today, you did 5. That's 3 more seconds of strength you never had before. Slowly, his mind began to shift. He was no longer a boy defined by a wheelchair, but a fighter, training in secret, building toward a destiny no one believed in. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves. One evening, Richard returned home earlier than expected. Passing by Ethan's room, he heard muffled thuds, followed by Grace's calm encouragement. Breathe, Ethan. You're stronger than this. One more try. Richard pushed the door open. The sight froze him. Ethan was gripping the bed frame, his knees buckling, sweat dripping down his forehead. Grace knelt beside him, her arms ready to catch him, whispering like a coach at the edge of a boxing ring. Richard's voice exploded. What is going on here? Grace leapt to her feet, startled. Ethan collapsed back into his chair, cheeks burning with shame. Richard stormed into the room, his face a storm of rage and confusion. Are you insane? You'll hurt him. Every doctor told me it's impossible. But before he could finish, Ethan shouted back, voice breaking with desperation. Maybe they're wrong, Dad. Maybe you're wrong. Almost a song. The words hit harder than any blow Richard had taken in a boardroom. His son had never raised his voice at him before. Grace placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him, then turned to Richard. He's not broken, Mr. Donovan. He's just never been given a chance. For a man who prided himself on absolute control, those words were unbearable. He ordered Grace out of the room and left without another word. But that night, lying awake in his vast, empty bedroom, Richard replayed the moment again and again. His son's cry, Grace's defiance, his own helplessness. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been blind. Despite Richard's anger, Grace didn't stop. Ethan begged her not to give up, and she couldn't bring herself to abandon him. So the training continued, now in secret. She waited until Richard was buried in late-night calls or absent in his endless business trips. The sessions grew longer, the progress greater. Ethan learned to balance without holding on, to shift his weight from one foot to the other, to take not just one step, but 2. Every fall left bruises, but every rise built strength. Grace encouraged him with a mantra, fall 7 times, stand 8. Ethan repeated it until it became a rhythm in his heart. The banquet had been Ethan's idea. Grace, he whispered days before the event, I want to surprise them. I want to stand in front of everyone so Dad finally believes. Grace hesitated. It was risky. His legs still trembled, his balance unsteady. What if he fell in front of all those people? What if the humiliation crushed him forever? But Ethan's eyes burned with determination. Please, I need to do this. Grace finally nodded, though her heart pounded with dread. That night, when Ethan rose before the stunned guests, Grace's hands clenched in silent prayer. And when he pointed to her as the reason, the secret she had guarded for months was suddenly laid bare. Richard's face flushed red, his chest rising and falling like a man drowning in disbelief. Tell me the truth, Grace, he demanded, his voice trembling. What did you do to my son? The room leaned forward. The chandelier above seemed to hold its breath. Grace stepped forward, steady despite the weight of every eye upon her. I gave him what no doctor ever did, she said softly. I gave him belief. The words struck like a hammer. Some guests wiped away tears. Others whispered in awe. But Richard felt something crack deep within his chest. For years, he had buried his heart beneath power and wealth. Now, a maid had exposed him with nothing but truth. The rest of the evening unfolded in a haze. Ethan, exhausted but glowing with pride, clung to Grace's hand as he returned to his chair. Guests swarmed with congratulations, some even bowing to Grace as though she were the hero of the night. Richard couldn't move, couldn't speak. The empire he had built, the certainty he had clung to, it all seemed meaningless compared to the miracle that had just unfolded before his eyes. For the first time in decades, the mighty millionaire felt small. As the banquet wound down, Richard lingered alone in the empty hall. The echoes of the night still haunted him, his son's defiant cry, Grace's fearless truth. He poured himself another glass of wine, but it tasted like ash. Staring at his reflection in the glass, he whispered to himself, "What if I've been wrong all along?" It was the question that would change everything, and it marked the true beginning of his transformation. The Donovan banquet had been meant to showcase power, Richard's power. The grand hall glittered with gold, crystal chandeliers shimmered above, and 100 guests in tailored suits and silk gowns whispered about stock prices and mergers. Richard had planned the evening down to the last polished silver fork. But now his empire was no longer the center of attention. His 7-year-old son was. Ethan, pale but radiant, had stood before them all. His thin legs trembled, his hands reached out for balance, but he stood. And in that instant, the balance of power in the Donovan family shifted forever. Richard's mind raced. For years he had been told impossible. For years he had buried hope under piles of medical reports. But now, before his very eyes, the impossible had happened. And not because of money, but because of a maid. Gasps filled the hall, cameras flashed, and murmurs rippled like wildfire. "Did you see that?" He stood. "How could this be? The maid! She's the one!" Richard's jaw tightened. The humiliation burned hotter than the awe. How dare Grace Johnson, a woman he had considered invisible, succeed where he had failed? He took a step forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "Tell me exactly what you've done to my son." For months, Grace had hidden in the shadows, guiding Ethan quietly, her victories private. Now there was no hiding. She stepped forward, the crowd parting as though instinctively recognizing the gravity of her role. She lifted her chin, eyes steady on Richard's piercing glare. "I didn't fix him, Mr. Donovan," she said calmly. "I simply gave him the chance to believe in himself." A stunned silence followed. The chandeliers glimmered like frozen stars, and the audience held its collective breath. Richard's face darkened, but Ethan's eyes shone with pride. The crowd's silence seemed to open a window back into the past weeks. The nights of struggle, the endless falls, the whispered mantra. Fall 7 times, stand 8. Viewers could see it like a montage. Ethan clinging to bedposts, tumbling to the carpet, Grace lifting him again and again. His tears, her quiet encouragement. His growing strength, her unwavering belief. And now all of it converged into this very moment in the banquet hall. Richard's hands trembled. He had built a billion-dollar empire on control. Yet here was his maid, challenging everything he thought he knew. His guests were no longer admiring him. They were admiring her. His voice cracked with fury. "You went behind my back. You defied my authority. Do you understand what you've done?" Grace did not flinch. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice steady. "Yes, Mr. Donovan. I gave your son something you never did. Hope." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted. Some guests turned to Richard, waiting for his retaliation. Others looked at Grace with admiration, even reverence. At that moment, Ethan's small voice broke the tension. His body shook, but his voice was stronger than ever. "Dad, don't be angry at her. Be angry at me if you have to, because I wanted this. I wanted to try. And she believed in me when you didn't." The hall fell deathly silent. Richard staggered back a step, as though struck. His son's words echoed in his chest, tearing at the armor he had worn for decades. When you didn't. It was the phrase that split him in two, the proud tycoon on one side and the broken father on the other. Richard's voice faltered. raw and unguarded. "Ethan, do you think I never believed in you?" Tears brimmed in the boy's eyes. "You believed in money. You believed in doctors. You never believed in me." The words stabbed deeper than any corporate betrayal ever had. Richard's knees nearly buckled. The room spun, not from wine, but from truth. Grace placed a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder, steadying him. Her gaze never left Richard. "Sometimes, Mr. Donovan, belief is the greatest medicine." The guests could no longer contain themselves. Some clapped, others murmured encouragement. A few openly wept. The maid's courage, the boy's defiance, the father's collapse. It was a drama more powerful than any opera. Richard turned to the crowd, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. The titan of industry was no longer in command. His empire could silence reporters, but it could not silence the truth playing out before every eye. For a long, agonizing moment, Richard said nothing. His pride screamed at him to reassert control, to fire Grace on the spot, to restore the order he had always demanded. But then he saw Ethan's trembling form, still fighting to stay upright, clinging not to wealth or prestige, but to the belief Grace had given him. And for the first time in his life, Richard Donovan felt powerless in the best possible way. The scene flashed back to Richard's own childhood, his father shouting that weakness was unforgivable, that failure was shameful. Richard had built his empire on that doctrine, and now he was passing the same curse onto his son. Grace's voice pulled him back to the present. "Mr. Donovan, wealth can buy comfort, but it cannot buy courage. Ethan has that within him. All he needed was for someone to see it." The room blurred. Richard felt hot tears sting his eyes. He wanted to deny her words, to push them away. But deep down, he knew she was right. In front of his entire empire, Richard Donovan broke. He sank to his knees before his son, his trembling hands reaching out. Ethan's legs gave way, and Richard caught him, not as a millionaire, not as a master of men, but as a father. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he whispered, voice shaking. "I should have believed in you first." The hall erupted in applause. Some guests rose to their feet. The mighty Richard Donovan, humbled before his son and his maid, was a sight no one would forget. Grace knelt beside them, tears glistening, but her expression calm. She had never sought power, never wanted recognition. She had only wanted Ethan to rise. And in that moment, all three of them, millionaire, son, and maid, were bound by something stronger than wealth: truth. As the applause echoed through the hall, Richard lifted his son in his arms, holding him close. The cameras flashed, immortalizing the moment. But deep inside, Richard knew this was not the end. This was only the beginning of a reckoning that would shake not just his family, but his entire empire. Because for the first time in his life, Richard Donovan would have to ask himself, what is the true measure of a man's wealth? The thunder of applause still echoed in Richard Donovan's ears, long after the last guest had left. The grand banquet hall, once alive with laughter and music, now lay in silence. Its marble floors stained with spilled wine, its chandeliers flickering like weary stars. Richard sat alone at the head table, his tie loosened, his hands trembling. He had faced corporate wars, political storms, and financial crises worth billions, but never had he felt so utterly exposed. His empire had not crumbled under a hostile takeover. It had cracked open under the gaze of his own son. Upstairs, Ethan slept soundly, his small body exhausted from the effort of standing. Grace had tucked him into bed with the same quiet care she had given for months. Richard lingered in the doorway, watching. The boy's chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his lips curved in the faintest smile. For once, Ethan did not look fragile. He looked victorious. The sight both warmed and shattered Richard's heart. "All this time, you were stronger than I ever realized," he whispered, though his son could not hear him. Behind him, Grace stood silently. When Richard finally turned, their eyes met. For the first time, he saw not a maid, not a servant, but the woman who had given his son a miracle. The next morning, Richard skipped his usual breakfast meetings. Instead, he sat with Ethan at the dining table, fumbling awkwardly with toast and orange juice. "Dad," Ethan whispered, his voice still hoarse from the night before. "Are you mad at Grace?" Richard froze. Every instinct told him to reassert authority, to remind his son that he, not a maid, was in control. But then he saw the hope in Ethan's eyes, the same hope Grace had nurtured. And so with a deep breath, he said words he had never spoken before. "No, son. I'm grateful to her, more than I can ever say." Ethan's smile was brighter than any boardroom victory Richard had ever known, yet not everyone shared Richard's gratitude. The Donovan household buzzed with tension. Some staff muttered that Grace had overstepped, that she had manipulated her way into influence. A few of Richard's business associates whispered that allowing a maid to publicly humiliate him was a sign of weakness. For a man who lived by reputation, the pressure was suffocating. His pride clawed at him, urging him to dismiss Grace and restore order. But each time he looked at Ethan, now practicing standing in small, careful bursts, Richard knew he could not go back. The true moment of decision came 3 days later, during a board meeting. Richard sat at the long oak table, surrounded by executives in sharp suits. They discussed profits, losses, mergers. But Richard's mind wandered, haunted by Grace's words. "Wealth can buy comfort, but it cannot buy courage." Finally, one executive dared to voice what others only thought. "Mr. Donovan, with respect, word of the banquet has spread. People are questioning your judgment. Some even say you've been softened by a maid." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. Richard rose slowly, his presence commanding as ever, but his voice carried a new weight. "If being softened means I finally see my son for who he is, then so be it. And if the world laughs at me for listening to a maid, let them laugh, because she has done what no fortune could. She gave my boy his life back." The executives shifted uncomfortably, but none dared argue. For the first time, Richard chose humility over pride. That was the turning point, not in business, but in fatherhood. Days turned into weeks. Richard began spending evenings with Ethan, watching him practice with Grace's guidance. Sometimes Ethan managed 3 steps, sometimes only 1. But each attempt was celebrated, not scorned. One night, as Ethan collapsed into his father's arms after a failed attempt, Richard whispered, "It's okay to fall, son. What matters is that you try again." Ethan looked up, astonished. "That's what Grace always says." Richard smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time I started listening." For the boy, it was the moment he realized he no longer had just a mentor in Grace. He finally had his father. It wasn't long before the outside world demanded answers. Reporters hounded the Donovan estate, desperate for the story of the miracle. For once, Richard did not hide behind lawyers or press releases. He held a press conference and standing before cameras with Ethan at his side and Grace just behind them. "My son's progress," Richard began, his voice steady, "is not the result of money, medicine, or miracles bought in foreign clinics. It is the result of faith. Faith that came from someone this family underestimated." He turned to Grace, his eyes softening. "Grace Johnson believed in my son when I did not. And because of her, he stands today. For that, I owe her more than words can repay." The flash of cameras lit up Grace's stunned face. For the first time, the world saw her not as a maid, but as the quiet hero who had changed everything. That evening, the Donovan household felt different. There was no grand banquet, no chandeliers blazing. Just a quiet dinner, Richard, Ethan, and Grace. Ethan laughed more than he had in years. Richard listened more than he spoke. And Grace, though still humble, carried herself with the dignity of a woman who knew she had shifted the course of a family's destiny. At one point, Ethan looked between them and said with childlike honesty, "I don't need a miracle anymore. I already have one. You both believe in me now." Later that night, Richard stood on the balcony, the city lights glittering below. For the first time in decades, he felt the burden of wealth lift from his shoulders. He realized that true power was not measured in dollars, but in love, faith, and courage. He whispered to himself, the words tasting strange but liberating, "Perhaps the greatest investment I'll ever make is in my own son." The weeks that followed marked a transformation no business magazine could have predicted. Richard Donovan, the man once defined by ruthless ambition, was no longer the same. He still wore tailored suits, still commanded respect in boardrooms, but something fundamental had shifted. His voice was softer at home, his gaze lingered longer on his son, and his empire was no longer his greatest concern. For Ethan, life blossomed in ways he had never imagined. Each day he grew stronger, taking more steps, holding himself upright for longer stretches. Sometimes he stumbled, sometimes he fell, but now he never faced the floor alone. His father was there, steady hands reaching out, not to scold, but to lift. And always Grace was beside him. One quiet afternoon, Richard stood by the window, watching Ethan practice across the garden. The boy's laughter floated on the breeze, mingling with the sound of birdsong. Grace walked beside him, offering encouragement, her hand ready to steady him, but never stealing his effort. Richard's chest tightened with a strange, humbling realization. For years he had believed himself the architect of everything, his fortune, his reputation, even his son's destiny. But here was proof that some victories cannot be bought. They must be nurtured. He turned to Grace, who had just joined him at the window. His voice was low but sincere. "You didn't just help my son stand, Grace. You helped me stand as a father." Her eyes glistened, but she said nothing. Sometimes silence carried more power than words. That evening, Richard gathered the household staff and his closest business associates in the same hall where his pride had once shattered. But this time, there was no banquet, no pretense of wealth, only a single spotlight shining down on Grace. Richard cleared his throat, the weight of a lifetime in his words. "For years, I believed wealth could solve anything, but tonight I want to acknowledge that the truest wealth is faith, love, and courage. And no one has taught me that more than Grace Johnson." He turned to her, his voice breaking. "From this day forward, Grace is not just an employee of this household. She is family." The staff gasped. Ethan, beaming with pride, ran, or rather, half stumbled, half walked, toward Grace and wrapped his arms around her. The hall erupted in applause, not out of obligation, but out of genuine joy. From that moment, the Donovan legacy changed course. Newspapers no longer ran headlines about mergers or corporate battles, but about the millionaire who humbled himself, the maid who defied limits, and the boy who stood because two people finally believed in him. Richard's empire remained vast, but for once he no longer cared about being the richest man in the room. Instead, he cared about being the kind of man his son could look up to. One late night, as Ethan drifted to sleep, he whispered to Grace and his father alike, "Thank you for believing." And in that fragile, beautiful moment, Richard realized something he would carry for the rest of his life. Wealth fades, but faith endures. Dear friends, this story is more than a tale of a boy learning to stand. It's about a father rediscovering love, a maid proving the power of quiet strength, and the reminder that the smallest acts of faith can create miracles. If you believe, like Ethan, that love and courage can help us rise above any obstacle, share this story with someone who needs hope today. And remember, if you like it, please subscribe and comment. If you don't like it, please like. It helps us bring more inspiring stories to life. Because at the end of the day, we all have the power to help someone stand.